I'm always on the road and often pick up hitchhikers. My only rule, they have to share the scariest story they've ever heard, and now I'm going to retell it to you. Write in the comments what city you're listening from. I may have driven by it. How would you react if a client told you something like, "Monsieur, I feel obliged to warn you. There's a superstition about this chair. Supposedly, if you sit on it, you'll die within the week. You needn't take it seriously. It's just foolish folklore. But were I in your place, I'd think twice before taking any risks, just in case." I merely smirked at my client's eccentricities. At the time, I thought he was just a neurotic germaphobe who couldn't bear the thought of anyone touching the sacred seat his own posterior would grace. In Marseille, you encounter people with all kinds of peculiar tastes, whether it's wine, bed partners, or pieces of furniture. If I'd been a little more perceptive then, I might have spared myself countless tragic deaths and my own misfortune. That day, my workshop, redolent with lacquer and wood shavings, was bathed in the dull light streaming through the window. I was pressing a piece against the workbench when I heard a knock at the door. Late evening, rain pattered on the glass, and the streetlights outside barely pierced the misty veil. I wasn't expecting anyone, but perhaps it was one of my regular clients. I took my time walking to the door, removed my gloves, and opened it. A man stood there, in an expensive, though thoroughly soaked, overcoat. His face was obscured beneath a hood, but the dim hallway light slid over his features, highlighting an exhaustion and a quiet unease. In his hands, he clutched a large package from which protruded the carved legs of a chair. "Are you Monsieur Lefebvre?" His voice was steady, though a slight tremor betrayed his grip on the bundle. "Yes." "How can I help you?" I replied, concealing my annoyance at this unexpected visitor. He introduced himself briefly, gave a name I didn't remember. Over the years, I'd met many like him, those who cared only for discretion and anonymity. He simply mentioned that he worked for an old and distinguished family who wished to have this chair restored. His low voice and the shadows falling across his face lent an uncomfortable weight to his presence. "Exquisite craftsmanship," I remarked, glancing at the chair legs peeking from the bag. The wood was high quality, echoing the Baroque period, likely from the time of Louis XIV, with intricate hand carvings, elegant lines, a touch of sophistication. This piece had known masterful hands. Yet one of the legs was broken, and deep cracks marred the backrest, as though someone had struck the wood in a fit of blind rage. "This will take considerable work," I said, running my fingers carefully along the splintered surface, assessing the wood's condition. "It seems this piece has quite a history." "It's not just history, Monsieur Lefebvre." The man leaned closer, his voice dropping lower. "They say that everyone who's ever sat in this chair has died, perhaps by chance, but death always followed." He fell silent, leaving his last words suspended in the air. "All kings die sooner or later," I chuckled, trying to mask my aversion to such superstitions. I'd heard plenty of similar tales. One of my older projects, a mirror from the 18th century, was said to reveal the true self, and those who saw it allegedly spiraled into despair or madness. Just another myth, nothing more. Every object has its own aura, its own energy, if you will, I said, sensing the absurdity of the conversation building. Yet my visitor remained deadly serious. His pale face didn't betray the slightest trace of humor as I searched his eyes, hoping for a glimmer of irony. Instead, he added, "I urge you to handle it with care. The family wants the chair returned in pristine condition, but should you choose to decline, they'll understand." His gaze lingered on me longer than it should have, and after a brief pause, he set the chair on the workbench, let out a deep sigh, and made his way to the exit. He left without a word of farewell, only the echo of his footsteps reverberating down the hallway. I shrugged. Usually, people who don't ask about the cost either don't care about money or have no intention of paying. If it's the former, then a double rate it is. If it's the latter, well, there was something strangely alluring about this chair. Left alone in the workshop with the dark silhouette of the chair that seemed to absorb the lamplight, I noticed its craftsmanship was impeccable, though its current state, chipped finish, cracks, darkened carvings, spoke of years of neglect, perhaps even sorrow. I felt an urge to begin the restoration right away. Pieces like this were always intriguing finds, and the more work they needed, the more captivating the restoration process. I set to work inspecting it. Armed with a magnifying glass, I examined each crack, each nick. Deep indentations marked the seat, as if someone had sat there for ages without rising, or was exceptionally heavy. The wood darkened under my fingers, and when I ran my hand over it, an odd, unsettling sensation crept up. It didn't feel entirely dry, as if it had long absorbed something and was now releasing it. Several days passed since my first contact with the chair, but I hesitated to start the actual restoration. Each time I drew near, an inexplicable anxiety took hold. My vision dimmed, and I struggled to breathe. I blamed it on age or fatigue. Yet there was something more. One evening, I sat opposite the chair and simply spoke to it, as a doctor might speak to a patient, explaining that its leg was broken and needed repair, that I understood its pain, and that I was here only to help. Strange as it may sound, that helped. Had I become so superstitious that such things now affected me? Over the next few days, I gradually sanded, cleaned, and treated the wood. Everything proceeded as usual, except that each time I worked, it felt as though the room grew darker. With each passing evening, each gray, rainy day, it seemed the chair absorbed the light from the room, leaving me alone with it in an intensifying gloom. On the third evening, as usual, I was preparing to wrap up for the day when I noticed the light in the workshop flicker suddenly. The bulb above the workbench trembled as if someone had breathed on it, though I knew all windows and doors were tightly shut. At first, I dismissed it as a coincidence, but when I left the workshop, I was confronted with my first unsettling discovery. A gray cat lay on the doorstep, its body oddly contorted, eyes wide open, staring into the distance as if it had died in terror. I froze, unable to look away from its glassy eyes, where raindrops reflected as they dripped from the roof above. The man's words echoed in my mind. Everyone who sat in this chair died. Nonsense, superstition. Yet a chill ran down my spine. Forcing myself to look away, I gingerly stepped around the animal's body, as though fearful of disturbing something invisible. In the dark, I noticed a small piece of paper blown against the threshold by the wind. It had something scrawled on it, but the rain had smeared the ink, leaving only blurred black stains. Ignoring it, I returned to the workshop, grabbed a box, dumped out my tools, and carefully placed the dead animal inside. Then I locked up and headed home, trying to shake off the strange thoughts that lingered. The next morning, I returned, ready to continue the work. The rain hadn't ceased, as though the city itself was mired in a constant melancholy that soaked into everything, from the gray facades to the empty streets. The workshop greeted me with the damp scent of wood, mingled with a faint, unpleasant note I couldn't quite place. It smelled of rot, decayed wood, as though something had been decomposing there, yet the cat had only died the night before. I approached the box and peered inside. The cat's body was half decayed, as if it had been dead for at least a week. Oddly enough, I thought the cat's position had changed, lying differently than how I had left it. Then something caught my eye. Hoping I was mistaken, I took a pair of tweezers and, rummaging through the remains, extracted a long red thread, exactly like the fabric of the chair's upholstery. Had the cat jumped on the chair and died there, or had it merely stumbled upon the thread by chance? This detail cast a grim and disturbing light on the situation. Evening was drawing to a close when another client entered the workshop. He was unfamiliar, a tall, middle-aged man with weary eyes. He glanced around, casting a brief look at the chair standing in the middle of the room, then turned to me. "Monsieur Lefebvre?" he asked, as though confirming he'd come to the right place. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" As he started explaining the issues with an old chest of drawers, his gaze kept drifting back to the chair. By now, I was used to that cursed seat drawing attention, as if it had a will of its own. Growing tired of his sidelong glances, I made a move to push the chair aside, but at that moment, the man sat down on it, as if on a whim. "It's a magnificent chair," he remarked to himself, studying the intricate carvings. "You know, I wouldn't mind buying it if you're selling." I was about to explain that it wasn't for sale, that it was here for another purpose, but Eloise stepped forward abruptly, her face troubled. "Sir, you shouldn't sit on it. This chair has a complicated history." Her voice was tense. The man looked at her, bemused, then chuckled, brushing off her words as if they were a mere superstition. With a shrug, he resumed discussing his restoration project, and then left, leaving us alone in silence. After he departed, a heavy stillness fell over the workshop. Eloise still stood by the chair, her gaze fixed upon it. "Do you really believe it's dangerous?" I asked, watching her with a vague unease. "I don't know," she replied, lowering her eyes. "But I had a bad feeling the moment he sat down. It's as if the chair wants something. It's hungry for a sacrifice." Her words made me pause, though I tried to suppress my fear. After all, it was just a chair, I reminded myself, merely an antique. But the next day, when we learned that the client had died in a bizarre accident, an icy dread took hold of me. I was expecting news from the client who had, quite incidentally, sat on the chair the previous day. He'd promised to return to finalize the details of the dresser restoration, and perhaps even discuss purchasing the chair, so I had mentally prepared for that conversation. But as the hours passed, there was still no sign of him. Finally, after several hours of waiting, I decided to call him to confirm our plans and remind him of our appointment. As the phone began to ring, an unsettling feeling washed over me, as though I were violating some unspoken rule. The line rang, and just as I was about to hang up, a voice answered. A woman's, broken with sobs and trembling. "I'm sorry, who is this?" she asked, struggling to steady herself. "This is Monsieur Lefebvre. I'm the restorer, and your husband visited us yesterday," I replied, feeling a cold fear rising slowly up my spine, gripping my chest. A strained breath escaped on the other end, and then the woman began to speak. Her voice grew quieter, her words slipping through, barely registering in my mind, as though I didn't want to hear them. "He died last night. They found him on the road." Her voice trembled. It was as if he'd been thrown from the car, though the doors were shut. Not a single scratch from the impact. He looked frozen, like he was trying to scream. The poor woman broke down into sobs. I tried to offer some comfort, but inside, a dark, sticky terror was spreading within me. Each word cut into my mind like a knife, slicing through the barrier I had built to protect myself from the horrific truth. The man who sat on the chair had died that very night, and his death was not just tragic, it was twisted, unnatural. The grimace on his face seemed to have captured his final silent plea. When I hung up, an icy dread settled over me. A coincidence? I couldn't believe that anymore. I imagined his face, frozen in terror, as if he'd seen the end coming, and I understood then that he hadn't merely died. The chair had claimed him, as it had claimed everyone who had ever sat upon it. Eloise, who had been standing in the doorway and overheard the end of my conversation, gripped her hands so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't seem to take her eyes off the chair, as though expecting it might strike at any moment. "This chair, it kills," she whispered, her voice weak and fractured, with no trace of doubt left, only suppressed fear. Despite everything, I resolved to bury myself in work, hoping to keep thoughts of these strange events at bay. As I cleaned another section of wood, I noticed a small engraving on the underside of the chair, faint and worn by time. They were initials, etched with a hand trembling with effort. 3 letters, almost invisible. My fingers traced them, trying to decipher their meaning, but the inscription was nearly gone, as though someone had deliberately tried to erase its trace. That evening, I heard footsteps outside my door, slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing in the hallway, thinking it might be a visitor or a neighbor. I opened the door, but there was no one there, only the dense darkness of the damp corridor. The rain continued its monotonous whisper, washing away all other sounds and casting a thick sense of emptiness around. After lunch, Eloise arrived at the workshop, young, energetic, with bright red hair and confident movements. She was a talented restorer, skilled with wood and tools, often helping me with particularly challenging projects. Eloise had a gift for bringing seemingly hopeless items back to life, a quality that made her invaluable. I decided to share the strange incidents surrounding the chair with her, hoping that a fresh perspective might ease my unease. "Oh, such a Baroque style. No wonder they brought it to you," Eloise remarked with enthusiasm, examining the chair's carved legs closely. "But don't you think there's something off about it? It smells odd." I smirked, trying to hide my own unease. "They say this chair is cursed. Supposedly everyone who sat on it has died. But you know, it's just old tales." Eloise paused, her fingers tracing the worn carvings, as if she were trying to uncover the chair's secrets. "Maybe we should just burn it," she suggested, half joking, but I caught a trace of sincerity in her voice. For some reason, I felt uncomfortable talking about these things in the chair's presence, as though it might hear us and decide to retaliate. Was I becoming paranoid? A week passed, and it felt as if the darkness around the chair continued to thicken. It seemed like the rain outside grew stronger each day, turning the streets into rivers of filthy water, sweeping away everything alive in its path. It was as though the entire city was sinking into an endless despair, echoing the cursed aura of that chair. And our only escape was to step willingly into the void, to accept the full weight of judgment. One evening, as I was about to close the workshop, there was a knock at the door. It was a tall man in a black suit and a heavy coat. He introduced himself as Antoine Charnay, an antiques collector, and, as he put it, an appreciator of items with a history. Though I knew immediately the name was false, Antoine Charnay had been my grandfather's name. Antoine had learned of the chair through his sources, and was prepared to pay handsomely to purchase it for his collection. Sensing my skepticism, he added, "You know, such objects always carry a hidden value. Centuries of history, Monsieur Lefebvre. It shouldn't be underestimated. Perhaps it's even more valuable than you realize." But I refused. There was a strange, almost irrational feeling that I had to complete the restoration, no matter what, as if the curse itself was urging me on. Besides, my reputation was on the line. Who did this charlatan think he was, borrowing my grandfather's name and attempting to buy off my client's prized possession? Antoine left, but not before handing me his card, saying his offer would be available whenever I felt it necessary. I tucked the card into my pocket without looking. Later, as I returned to the work, Eloise suggested we stay late to finish the restoration sooner. I'm not sure why I agreed, but we spent hours in silence, meticulously cleaning the wood, stripping the old varnish, smoothing out the cracks. The darkened workshop was engulfed in a silence so thick and tense, it felt like dense smoke had filled the air. Eloise and I froze at the sound of footsteps outside the door. They were careful, but too heavy to be a passing pedestrian. Someone was definitely approaching the entrance. "Do you hear that?" Eloise whispered, her voice betraying a hint of the fear she was trying to suppress. I nodded, signaling her to stay still. In the dead silence, we heard the lock mechanism on the front door snap from a heavy blow. We froze, exchanging tense glances, silently hoping we'd both imagined it. A crushing stillness fell over the room, only to be broken by the sound of someone inserting a screwdriver into the broken lock and turning it. There was no doubt about it. We were being robbed. I nodded to Eloise and she whispered, "I'll call the police." I stood motionless, watching her movements in the dim lamplight. She reached for her coat, rummaging through its pockets in search of her phone. But it seemed she'd left it somewhere in the workshop, and there was no time to search for it now. The door swung open suddenly, revealing two men in masks. One was a hulking man with a tattoo snaking up his neck, wielding a flashlight, while the other, younger, scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the chair in the center. Eloise shrank back into her coat, and I held my breath, watching from the corner. The men approached the chair, looking around. One of them smirked. "Well, Monsieur Lefebvre," the older man said, casting his gaze around the workshop before finally noticing me. His voice was a chilling whisper that sliced through the darkness. "We've heard you have something valuable here. Leave," I said, forcing confidence into my voice despite my pounding heart. "There's nothing here for you." Eloise stood beside me, gripping a wood chisel tightly. Fear flickered across her face, but she didn't back down. "Oh, don't be so sure of that," the younger man sneered, his eyes flicking back to the chair. "This is the one, isn't it? The chair with the legends? They say it's cursed, kills everyone who sits in it." I stepped forward, trying to block his view. "That's just a foolish story," I replied coolly. "The chair's nothing special. Take what you want and go." But they weren't listening. The younger man, with a cocky grin, moved closer to Eloise, grabbing her roughly by her work apron. "Well, maybe the girl should test it out," he sneered. Eloise shot me a panicked look, still clutching the chisel tightly, her grip concealed from their view. "Why's everyone so uptight?" the young man mocked, glancing back at his partner. He yanked Eloise towards the chair. She jolted and began to resist, struggling against him. Growing impatient, he reached into his pocket, as if to pull out a knife or something worse. But it all happened in an instant. Eloise slashed at his face with the chisel, leaving a raw gash across his cheek. He clutched his face, staggered back, and stumbled right into the chair. Everything went still. "You little bitch!" the young man snarled, hands dropping from his face to reveal the bloody slash across his cheek. He pulled out a knife. A fleeting thought passed through my mind that we wouldn't make it out alive tonight. Then, suddenly, there was a faint metallic creak, like the sound of a decaying ship slowly dying on the shore. The metal fixture holding the overhead light came crashing down with a deafening crack, hitting the young intruder on the head and almost splitting his skull in two. The impact knocked his body off the chair, leaving him sprawled lifeless on the floor. The silence that followed the shattering of bone and the ringing echo was unbearable. The older intruder stood frozen, paralyzed, as if suddenly understanding what had just happened. Eloise slowly lowered her hands, her eyes fixed on the body, a silent horror reflected in her gaze. "Eloise, you," I whispered, and she looked at me, giving a dazed nod. I didn't mean he was going to." Her voice trailed off, and she swallowed hard, her fingers turning white as she gripped them together. The older intruder, shaking, began backing toward the door, his face twisted with fear, muttering under his breath in an unintelligible stream, his teeth clenched. Glancing at us, he managed to say only one thing: This place is cursed." The silence that followed was thick, as if the air itself was tainted, clinging to the walls, the tools, and our faces. The older man, casting one last look at the lifeless body of his partner, stumbled back, knocking over a few tools that clattered to the ground. He raised his eyes, filled with terror, to meet ours. You don't understand." His voice was hoarse, muted, as if he were speaking to himself. "The chair. It kills everyone who touches it." I steadied myself, trying to snap him out of his stupor. "Get out of here while you still can," I said sharply, feeling an all-consuming tension enveloping the three of us. "Forget the chair." For a moment, he seemed unwilling to believe my words, standing there, repeatedly glancing back at his friend's lifeless body. But in the end, his nerve broke. He took one step back, then another, and finally turned, bolting from the workshop as if death itself were chasing him. The door slammed shut behind him, and Eloise and I were left alone with the cursed chair and the blood slowly pooling from the corpse on the floor. Eloise finally broke the silence. "I didn't mean to." Her voice trembled, her gaze fixed on me, horror evident in her expression. But there was something else there that I hadn't expected. Guilt. He was going to... He threatened us, and I didn't think. I just pushed him and... She lowered her gaze, as if trying to hide her thoughts from me. "It's not your fault," I said, though even I wasn't entirely convinced by my own words. "It was just a coincidence, nothing more." Eloise pressed her lips together, casting a wary glance at the chair, then took a few steps back, as though trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and the object that had already become something ominous, something we'd best not touch. I saw a fleeting look in her eyes, a desire to leave it all behind and walk away. But instead, she unexpectedly spoke. "I have to try." I froze. Her words hung in the air, each second stretching endlessly. I wanted to stop her, to grab her hand and pull her away from the chair, but something kept me rooted in place, an inexplicable force that felt like icy chains binding me. "What are you saying?" I asked, feeling a chill settle over me, holding me in place. "If you think it's just a coincidence, then I should be able to sit on the chair without dying. But if you don't believe that, then it means I killed him by pushing him onto this damn chair." She stepped forward, eyes fixed on the chair. One step, another. I could see something wild flickering in her gaze, barely contained, as though she herself didn't fully understand what she was doing but couldn't resist. For a brief moment, I thought she might be bluffing, trying to push me into admitting there was something wrong with the chair. I grabbed her hand, intending to stop her, but she was already standing right next to it. She began to pull away, yelling something incoherent at me. In a flash of anger or desperation, she bit my hand, and I released her, startled by the pain. Helplessly, I watched as she placed a trembling hand on the backrest and slowly lowered herself onto the seat, as if in a trance. Her eyes were vacant, as if her consciousness was somewhere far away. A second passed, and then I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. A creak, like someone or something invisible had slid along the walls, as cold as a ghostly breath or an unseen hand. The lamp in the corner began to sway, casting monstrous, elongated shadows over us, like dark hallucinations. But nothing more happened. Moments ticked by. She sat in the chair, the body of the dead intruder sprawled nearby, and I stood before them both. It looked like some grim painting from the past, depicting a scene of mythic horror. Eloise sat there, trapped in a kind of hypnotic stillness. I could barely breathe, unable to pull her from this state, as though I too was bound by invisible chains. Minutes passed, but then the silence was broken by a sudden noise. Her hand slipped from the backrest and struck the carved base of the chair. She flinched, and a flash of awareness returned to her eyes. For a moment, I thought it was over, that nothing had happened to her. But I was wrong. Eloise shot to her feet, breathing heavily as if she'd just escaped a nightmare. Her face was pale, but her eyes gleamed with a wild intensity, a mix of fear and something more unsettling, a dangerous exhilaration. "Did you see that?" she whispered, and I couldn't tell if she was shaking from terror or something far more perilous. "Eloise, don't touch that chair again. Do you hear me? Whatever you felt, leave it behind and go." "I'll deal with it myself," I said, my voice firm but laced with desperation. "Deal with it? Did you see what happened?" She tried to laugh, but her voice wavered. "This chair, it's alive somehow. It calls out, and I can't get it out of my head." I could see how hard it was for her to resist its call, as if some invisible thread bound her to that cursed chair. We called the police. The wait was torturous, and we stepped out into the hallway to escape the sight of the dead body and the chair. We smoked silently, staring out the narrow window into the night over Marseille. The police arrived fairly quickly, within an hour. They dutifully recorded our statements. Naturally, we kept the chair's curse to ourselves, photographed the broken lock, removed the body, and left. It seemed I wouldn't have much trouble with the law after all. Unable to bear staying near the chair any longer, I gripped Eloise's shoulder, almost forcing her out of the workshop, and locked the door behind us. "Let's take a walk," I suggested, though I doubted a simple stroll would relieve the tension. But I needed to get her away from that cursed place, away from the chair and its unseen influence. We stepped outside, and the rain hit us like an icy wall, making us shiver. The city, draped in heavy clouds, looked lifeless, as if the rain had washed away its last remnants of color. The cobblestones glistened, reflecting the flickering streetlights, and the shadows of buildings stretched like endless chasms. Every corner felt fraught with hidden danger. "We should just get rid of it," Eloise finally said after a long silence, as we approached an old abandoned church where I'd once stored items I couldn't sell. "Maybe we can leave it here. Let it fade into oblivion. We've dealt with worse." The abandoned church, with its high tower, seemed like the perfect place to dispose of this cursed object. I knew no one had entered this place for ages. Most people didn't even remember it existed. We walked in slowly, breathing in the damp, moldy air, as if the place had long lost anything that might bring it to life. We'd brought the lamps from the workshop, their dim light casting long shadows on the moss-covered walls. Eloise walked cautiously down the central aisle, her fingers brushing the ancient wooden pews, wrapped in cobwebs. She slowed down, her gaze darkening, and I thought I saw a shadow of something sinister flicker in her eyes. She moved forward, as though guided by some unseen force. I followed, feeling the air thicken around us, becoming sticky and heavy, as if it meant to trap us in this forgotten place. In the corners of the church, something seemed to stir, barely visible in the faint glow of our lamps. The old church seemed to breathe, as though it harbored its own life, and we, intruders, had disturbed its slumber, awakening a hidden darkness. "Maybe it will find peace here," Eloise murmured, almost inaudibly, as if in a trance. "Or maybe it will leave us alone." She turned to me slowly, and in her eyes, I saw a strange mix of despair and a kind of dreadful resignation, as if she had already accepted a fate she couldn't escape. A faint smile touched her lips as she glanced around, and then her gaze fixed on me once more. "You feel it too, don't you?" she asked, a hint of madness creeping into her voice. "It won't let us go, you know. It's not just a chair, it's something ancient, something dark, and it wants us." "Eloise," my voice came out sharper than I intended. "Enough. Let's leave it here, and we'll forget about it. We can live if we just leave this city and put it all behind us." She shook her head, as though my words couldn't reach her. Her face froze in a strange, unnerving calm that made my fear only grow sharper. "You think it's that simple?" she whispered. "You think I haven't tried to forget? It's in me now, and now I'm part of it. A sudden, muffled thud echoed through the abandoned church. Our light swayed, and one of its beams caught something peculiar on the floor beneath the old altar niche. A tiny, long-dried handprint, small, childlike, as if someone had tried to claw their way out, leaving desperate marks forever imprinted in the dust. Eloise leaned down, entranced. Ignoring my desperate whispers to stop, she reached out slowly, touching the ancient print, as though she wanted to feel the chill of centuries-old darkness. "They're all here," her voice dropped, becoming unnaturally low. "They're watching us, waiting for us to join them." My mind rebelled against the reality around me. It felt as though I'd fallen into a fevered nightmare where every movement was thick and suffocating. I pulled at her arm, but she had become as rigid as a statue. Then, with a shudder, she broke from her stillness and turned sharply to the chair we'd brought, as though staring into the eyes of an invisible presence. Before I could stop her, she sat on it again, as if surrendering herself to its power, succumbing to an ancient call she could no longer resist. Then I heard it, a faint rustling from behind the columns. The dim light revealed shifting shadows creeping around the corners of the church, moving in sync with her breath. Eloise sat motionless on the chair, looking as though her very soul had been drained. It seemed that someone unseen had leaned over her from the darkness, sinking cold claws into her mind, dragging her down. Summoning all my strength, I forced myself to approach, even as a primal dread toward this ancient object took hold of me. Finally, wrenching Eloise free from the chair's clutches, I led her out of the church and locked the door, hoping that the entities awakened by that cursed piece of furniture would remain sealed within. But the following days brought no peace. Even after leaving the chair in the darkest corner of the old church, strange occurrences continued to plague me. Eloise had not been seen since that night. Her phone was silent, her home deserted. I informed the police about her disappearance, trying to spin it as the possible act of an accomplice to the dead intruder. A thin excuse, but one that I clung to, hoping it was true. Facing a criminal was one thing. Facing an unstoppable, unknowable force was something else entirely. Unable to accept her disappearance, I decided to go to her home, hoping against hope that this was all some terrible mistake. Rain pounded relentlessly, icy drops beating against the roof as I climbed the stairs to her apartment. Reaching her door, I found the familiar spare key hidden beneath a flower pot, whispering a silent prayer that I'd find her there, alive and safe. When I opened the door, I was met with silence. The apartment was far too quiet, as if any trace of life had long since departed. In the dim light of the room, I noticed something strange. There wasn't a single chair. Every piece of furniture she could sit on was gone. Only cushions were scattered across the floor in the living room. There wasn't a stool, not even a single armchair. It was as if she had purged her home of anything resembling a chair. Fear gripped my heart. I realized she must have truly believed in the curse. Perhaps she even felt its presence when we were near that chair. Swallowing hard, I turned back to the door, trying to push away the fog of disturbing thoughts that clouded my mind. When I returned home, a sense of unease overwhelmed me, as though something had changed. I walked into my own living room, and the moment I turned on the light, it felt like ice water had been poured over me. Every chair, every stool, and every piece of seating in my house now looked exactly like that cursed chair. The wood had darkened. The seats had become hard and unyielding like stone. Even my dining chairs now ominously resembled the chair I'd returned to the workshop. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat ran down my spine. That chair had invaded my surroundings, turning every piece of furniture into a symbol of my guilt. A single thought crossed my mind. If I sat on any of these chairs, the curse would claim me too. I stepped back, my movements hesitant and shaky. The chairs surrounded me now, forming a tight circle. In horror, I unplugged the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, hoping that the shadows would dispel the vision. But even in the dark, I felt as if they were inching closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to rid myself of these visions. When I opened my eyes and switched the light back on, the room was normal again. No cursed chairs, only silence and emptiness. I knew I had to do something, to learn more, to get to the bottom of this curse, which I no longer wanted to believe in, yet felt everywhere around me. I began my search in the town archive. Old, dusty, hidden away in the basement of the municipal building. It looked as though everyone had forgotten it existed, save for the insects clinging to its yellowed pages. My footsteps echoed through the corridors, the whispers of time filling each crumbling file. I pored over articles and documents, flipping through pages where the printed words barely peeked through a web of cracks. At last, among a pile of records on antique ownership, I stumbled upon several documents regarding the family that owned the chair. An old lineage, one of the city's most esteemed in centuries past, now reduced to a faint memory. I discovered the origins of a curse that had haunted this family since the early 19th century. Every head of the family died under mysterious circumstances, and each time the chair was somehow present. The record was vague, filled with gaps and speculation, yet the generational fear was almost palpable. After finishing in the archive, I went to the old cemetery, hoping to convince myself this was merely urban legend. The graves, covered in mud and moss, lay in rows beneath the heavy sky. The whole place looked abandoned, as though even death avoided lingering here too long. I walked along a narrow path between the crypts, occasionally glancing at the names carved into the stone, until I found the family name mentioned in the records. I froze before an ancient tombstone, weathered and cracked, a piece of stone lying beside it like a fractured skull. As I bent down to examine the inscription, I felt a presence behind me. Turning quickly, I saw nothing but gray shadows and rain-soaked gravestones. The air was thick, almost sticky, and each breath felt like inhaling stagnant water. With difficulty, I forced myself to step away from the grave, feeling an icy knot in my chest. As I opened the door, silence greeted me, thick and suffocating. The apartment seemed emptied of life, as though whatever had once inhabited it had fled long ago. In the dim light, I noticed something unsettling on the bedroom floor. A small wood chip, innocuous yet terrifying, almost like a warning. Barely visible in the faint glow of the nightlight, it looked like a sliver from the cursed chair. A shiver of déjà vu passed through me. I didn't recall picking it up or getting it caught in my clothing. Yet, there it was, unmistakably a fragment of that chair. Clutching it in my palm, I felt a faint burning, as though it was branding my skin. The following morning, unable to ignore the relentless fear pressing in on me, I returned to the abandoned church. The rain drizzled steadily, casting a cold, heavy mist over the city, and I felt as though Marseille itself was watching me. Echoes of the previous night's whispers and glimpses of horror reverberated in my mind. I knew that I'd find no peace until I uncovered the nature of this curse. At the church entrance, a shudder ran through me, as if my nerves were reacting to the oppressive energy permeating the place. Inside, the cold was laced with an ancient sorrow. I scanned the room, searching for the chair that now haunted my thoughts. And then, there it was. The chair remained where I'd abandoned it that ill-fated night, yet it seemed different. Darkness had gathered around it, and the air, thick with the acrid scent of burned wood, felt nearly impossible to breathe. I moved closer, fear chilling me to the bone, and reached out toward the backrest. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like this gesture held the answers I sought. Before I could touch it, however, the church door creaked open. In the shadowed doorway, I saw a figure I instantly recognized, Antoine Charnay, the collector who had once tried to purchase the chair. He stepped inside, surveying the dimly lit church, before his gaze settled on me, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Monsieur Lefebvre," he said with the same cold courtesy as before. "I suspected we'd have this conversation again. I've been keeping an eye on you." I didn't respond, feeling my tension rise. Charnay walked closer, his eyes brimming with a dark, almost sick pleasure. "I gather you've felt the effects of this remarkable object," he continued, his gaze fixed on the chair. "You know, items like these rarely find such sensitive owners." Sensitive? I couldn't contain myself. "This chair kills people. It's a curse. It's invaded every part of my life." "How can you find that interesting?" Charnay chuckled, but there was no mirth in it. "It's more than just a curse, Monsieur Lefebvre. This is an ancient force, bound to this family and this chair. Their ancestors placed something within it that none of us can truly comprehend. You see, I collect these items because I know how to handle them. This chair, it's merely a fraction of the terror you can't even fathom, but which to me is routine. Unfortunately, you ignored my warning, and now you're too deeply entangled with this object. Now, it's your burden." "What are you saying?" A cold sweat prickled down my spine. "Each historical artifact contains its own life force, and it chooses its master," he murmured, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This chair has chosen you. It's been watching, testing you. Had you listened to me, you could have avoided all this trouble. But your arrogance blinded you, and now you're paying the price." He looked me straight in the eyes, and I caught a glint of hatred, and perhaps envy. "So, Monsieur Lefebvre, you have only one path left. You must claim it as your own, embrace it, become part of its destiny. Or," he trailed off, his eyes glinting with a hint of madness, "it will consume you, just as it consumed Eloise." Before I could fully grasp his words, I felt the darkness thickening around the chair, as if it were alive. Antoine Charnay stepped back, leaving me alone with the cursed object. Everything inside me rebelled against what I had to do, but I knew I had no other choice. Once Charnay disappeared into the shadows, I felt as though his presence lingered just beyond the threshold, his gaze still piercing into my mind. I shut my eyes, trying to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't rid myself of the strange sensation that something unseen had been passed on to me. The moment I realized I couldn't just abandon the chair here, a wave of dread washed over me. Taking a deep breath, I grasped it and began hauling it back to the workshop. Oddly, the chair felt weightless as I carried it, almost as if it guided me, urging me onward with invisible hands. For the first time in my life, accustomed as I was to the heft of wood and the familiar scent of old varnish, I was afraid of what I held in my hands. When I finally reached the workshop and locked the door behind me, the clouds parted and moonlight spilled through the window, flooding the room with an icy glow. I placed the chair in the center of the room and stepped back, studying it like a suspect under interrogation. A narrow strip of light fell across it, casting shadows that seemed to shift and writhe across the backrest, bending into strange shapes whenever I glanced away. "So, what now?" I muttered, more to myself than to the chair. In response, the silence thickened, filled with the distant hum of rain against the window, muffled yet somehow pervasive. The sound grew louder, as if torrents of water were striking the glass with increasing force, transforming into an indistinct, almost hostile roar. I moved closer, examining the carvings. Everything looked the same as before, but now each intricate pattern seemed more complex, each curve darker and deeper. Leaning in, I noticed one leg of the chair had blackened, as if scorched. I reached out, brushing my fingers over it, only to feel a sharp itch spread across my skin. I jerked my hand back, rubbing it, but the sensation wouldn't fade. Just as I wiped my palm, I heard footsteps in the corridor, sharp, deliberate. They grew closer until they stopped right outside the workshop door, as if whoever was out there was debating whether to enter. I froze, straining to catch every sound, unable to move. "Who's there?" My voice sounded loud in the empty room, though my throat felt dry as dust. Silence was my only answer. I stood still, listening to the rain hammering on the streets outside. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps resumed, fading into the darkness. Turning back to the chair, I noticed that something had changed on its surface. Shadows rippled across the polished wood, forming faint shapes that resembled twisted arms and legs, frozen in a pose of agony. I could barely make out the details, but the feeling that the chair held traces of all its previous owners became unbearable. Unable to stand the strange illusion any longer, I dragged the chair to a far corner of the workshop and threw an old cloth over it, hoping that covering it would somehow block its gaze, which I still felt lingering on me. But as soon as I took a few steps away, I could have sworn it moved. Returning, I found it exactly where I had left it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The chair haunted my thoughts, its shape looming in every raindrop and shadow beyond the window. As dawn approached, I drifted into a shallow, restless slumber, haunted by the feeling that someone was watching, reaching into my mind with cold, sticky fingers. When I awoke, there was an envelope on the workshop table, damp with rainwater. It was heavy, almost as if the letter itself retained the weight of a storm. I tore it open, bewildered as to who could have delivered it, and read the lines scrawled in an unsteady hand. Monsieur Lefebvre, you have disregarded all timelines, and we conclude that you have taken something that does not belong to you. Return it while you still have a choice. Sincerely, your client. The words filled me with a surge of anger laced with panic. How dare he threaten me? I was certain the letter was from the strange client who'd first brought me the chair. Yet what unnerved me most was that the handwriting seemed strangely familiar. I folded the letter and shoved it onto the shelf with other paperwork, hoping it would trouble me no further. But the words lingered, seeds of doubt taking root. I couldn't shake the feeling that the chair truly belonged to him, or someone who would stop at nothing to reclaim it. Days passed before I dared to look at the chair again. By then, the weather had cleared, but the workshop felt colder, a chill that couldn't be explained by the morning air or the cloudy sky. Every time I neared the corner where it lay hidden, the oppressive weight within me grew. That's when I decided I had to rid myself of it, once and for all. That night, I drove it to the shore, where twisted trees and crashing waves created an atmosphere that felt as barren and lifeless as the cursed chair itself. I intended to burn it here, on this desolate beach, far from any prying eyes. As I built the fire, a strange moan echoed from the forest. It might have been the wind in the branches, but in that moment, I no longer believed in coincidences. When the flames finally took hold of the chair, I heard a whisper within the smoke, words, disjointed and ominous, murmuring things I couldn't understand. The fire crackled, but the chair seemed to resist the flames. Burning so slowly, it was as though it refused to be destroyed. I stood there in the dim light, surrounded only by the night sounds, waiting for the curse to burn away with it. As dawn's first light crept over the horizon, I found myself on the beach among the smoldering ashes and charred fragments, feeling hollow and stripped bare, like scorched earth. The chair's ashes clung to me, stinging my skin, embedding themselves like scars. In my mind, I still heard a whisper. Eloise's voice, cold and reproachful, drifting from the fire's crackle and the lapping waves. She stood there, on the edge of dream and reality, like a shadow brought to life, one I had lost to my reckless pride. "You promised you could handle it," her voice hissed, soft as silk soaked in venom. "You told me you had it under control, that it was just work." She stood still, silent and unreachable, her disappointment coiling around me, every word tightening like an invisible noose around my neck. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but only hoarse gasps escaped my lips. My guilt, like an unwanted curse, consumed me. Everything I touched I had ruined, leaving nothing but ashes and lost souls in my wake. As I trudged back into the city, stumbling aimlessly through its winding alleys, I felt as though shadows trailed behind me, as though Eloise's whispers slipped from one house to the next, from narrow alleyways into my own shadow. It seemed as if the entire city had turned its back on me. In every passerby's gaze, I saw reproach. In every shadow, her accusatory stare. When I reached the workshop, I found the door ajar, a police car parked in front. The officers exchanged muted, clipped words, and my feet felt rooted to the ground. They took me by the arm and led me to the station, and I walked like a man who had lost himself, erased from the world. I was arrested. Then, as I awaited questioning, they informed me that the client's family had insisted on a meeting. I barely understood the purpose of this, but before my interrogation, they led me into a room where the elderly man who had first brought the chair to my workshop was waiting. This time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood his son, his face bearing a cold but confident smile. The old man, seemingly oblivious to my broken state, took a seat across from me, looking at me with an icy calm that felt devoid of fear or doubt. Under his gaze, an uncomfortable chill seeped through me. "Monsieur Lefebvre," he began, his voice carrying a hint of regret, "perhaps you do not fully understand the treasure you had in your possession. This chair has belonged to our family for centuries, serving a purpose far beyond simple antiquity. No, its historical significance is far greater." I felt anger boiling inside me, but managed to hold it in, giving him a short nod, trying to grasp his point. "Our gatherings," he continued, fixing his gaze upon me, "are rare but meaningful events, often attended by complex individuals who, at times, question the harmony that has long been cultivated here in Marseille. Traditions passed down from generation to generation help balance things." I saw his son smirk slightly, glancing at me with a look that felt as if he saw right through me. The elderly man went on, his voice steady and calm, each word cutting into me like a slender, cold blade. The majestic atmosphere, the ancient relics, all these elements create an impression. His voice grew softer, almost conspiratorial. Many, upon sitting in that chair, come to understand some positions, uncomfortable though they may be for Marseille and its people, come with great responsibility. Do you understand, Monsieur Lefebvre? A responsibility toward our citizens. His words were smooth, but their true meaning crept forward like a hidden pattern on a faded canvas. This chair had been their tool, a means to inspire those who needed to reconsider their intentions, to intimidate them if necessary, leaving no visible trace. His son, catching my gaze, leaned forward, taking over. "But now," he said with a sorrowful smirk, "our family's heirloom is gone, our symbol. We'd hate to see Marseille lose such an important tradition, one that instills respect and maintains, shall we say, order." A threat gleamed in his eyes as he continued, raising his voice slightly, as if to emphasize his words. I trust the court will take your carelessness into account and recognize the value this chair held, not only for our family, but for the peace of Marseille. With that, they rose, their expressions unchanging, and I understood that the outcome of this case had already been decided. Later, in the cold walls of the interrogation room, I was informed that Eloise was dead. One of those robbers who had fled that night tracked her down, as consumed by the chair as I had been, as if the ghost of dead wood haunted him as it did me. Driven by a senseless, fevered madness, he killed her before fleeing, only to meet his own end soon after. I felt frozen, suspended in that black moment, each word chipping away at my mind like an abandoned building slowly crumbling beneath harsh winds. Then came other words, heavy as iron chains. The family to whom the chair belonged has filed suit against you. Their one remaining inheritance, their ancient relic, destroyed. Historical value, the prosecutor said, unblinking, emotionless, and I responded with a harsh, unnatural laugh, the laugh of someone who no longer held to the boundaries of reality. I spoke of curses, of voices, of death that followed that chair, but my words, my shouts and whispers, shattered against a wall of indifference. They exchanged quick glances, the look people give someone condemned, and now I'm here, within the gray walls of an asylum, stripped of my past, my present, and any hope of a future. The nights here are dark and silent, as though life itself has forgotten the way. Sometimes I still hear her, Eloise's quiet voice drifting through the corners, her soft laughter echoing behind me when I'm alone. In moments of silence, I feel her reproach piercing my mind like a thorn lodged deep. And although I'll never again work with wood, varnish, or antiques, I flinch every time I sit down. For every time I lower myself onto a chair, it feels as if something ancient and dark waits beneath me, biding its time, ready for me to touch the curse once more. But at least here, among endless corridors, surrounded by faded faces and indifference, on these simple, wretched chairs, here, I can sit without fear. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.